Thank you all for coming, especially for making the trek all the way down here. Dr. Phelps won the Nobel Prize for what he calls the unified field theory of economics. Actually, he didn't call it that, but no, you did. But today he's going to talk about capitalism and what makes a capitalist economy different from either a socialist or a corporatist economy. I had a speaker a couple of years ago, Luigi Zingales from Chicago, who is kind of a soul brother of Dr. Phelps. If any of you came to that, you recognize the themes here that neither the right nor the left would be totally happy with what Dr. Phelps has to say. The left for reasons he'll tell you about, and the right because they tend to favor big business rather than, or rather I would say that being pro-business is not the same as being pro-market. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Edmund Phelps.
Thank you, Bob, very much. It's a real pleasure to be here at Google. This is my first time here. And I'm very pleased to talk about my book, Mass Flourishing. The book is about the modern economies that arose in a few nations in the 19th century. Britain and America around 1820, later Germany and France. Economies that remained well-functioning until the middle of the 20th century. They were the marvel of the world. The wonder was not so much the high wages and wealth. There was rampant prosperity, material and non-material. Mark Twain spoke of, quote, the drive and push and rush and struggle of the raging, tearing, booming 19th century. One kind of prosperity was classical. Modern economies were achieving growth of economic knowledge, thus growth of productivity. Hence, wage rates and working conditions were improving throughout the economy. A worker could just ride the rising tide. And modern economies and non-modern economies, through trade and technological transfers, could tap into that kind of prosperity in order to catch up. Another kind of prosperity was modern and of key importance. There were gains in one's earning power from one's new insights and skills, and gains in one's satisfaction from new experiences in one's work. These gains, material and non-material, are rewards of initiating and creating. They represent succeeding, or to use the term I will use, prospering. Non-modern nations could not tap into that kind of prospering. Never before had prospering been within reach of large and increasing numbers. Before the first modern economies, around 1820, economic knowledge, thus productivity, was virtually stagnant, even in economies that were the jewels of mercantile capitalism, such as Spain and Holland. The concept of job satisfaction was unknown. For me, the lone shepherd, bored by the routine and isolated from his fellows, symbolizes that system. The new mass prospering was brought by mass innovating, though the historians spoke only of resources, efficiencies, and increasing returns to scale. In the stream of new products and methods, some found adoption by consumers or producers, changing the complexion of the economy. In Britain and America especially, there was a welter of innovations, large and small, not just headline innovations. In an 1858 lecture, Abraham Lincoln said of America that there was a perfect rage for the new, a rage that was rife among makers of products as well as users of products. Where did ideas for innovation come from? The German historical school and the young Austrian Joseph Schumpeter believed that innovations originated from a succession of discoveries by scientists and navigators who were generally exogenous to the economy, and the commercial applications of these discoveries by entrepreneurs. But the modern economies possess their own economic dynamism, the desire, the capacity, and the scope to innovate. This led to an outpouring of imagining, tinkering, testing, and trying out. These economies were capable of indigenous innovation, not just the exogenous innovation of the mercantile capitalism. The system of dynamism was more effective the more open it was to contributors down to the grassroots. And the modern economies were rather open to the grassroots. Human resources of initiative and imagination were devoted to innovating, not just producing and trading. Dynamism ran high to the middle of the 20th century. No wonder there was mass prosperity. No economy before had drawn on the imagination of such a wide range of the nation's minds. This dynamism required entrepreneurs and financiers, of course, just as the sporadic innovations of the mercantile period did. Their judgment and expertise was needed. Yet dynamism further required innovators with the insight, imaginativeness, and vision to dream up new products that might pan out and win adoption. Yet the idea that business activity in a free market can always be depended upon to possess the dynamism for indigenous innovation is a mistake. The right stuff is required. Innovators often have to buck conventional thinking and to break away from the traditional ties to families and friends. Also, innovating requires a social and political climate that is receptive to innovations despite the disruptions that they are apt to cause. Was the modern economy desirable? Modern economies yielded a sustained rise of material benefits, including rising productivity and wages, decreasing disease, poverty, and pauperism, and increasing inclusion. In the worst factories, workers at least had escaped the farm. The more radical impact of the new economies was non-material. They changed the very nature of life and work where they took root. There were experiential rewards from working on new problems, gathering insights, imagining and creating novel things, testing them in the workplace, and trying them out in the marketplace. And there were existential rewards of self-discovery and personal growth from journeying into the unknown. The adventurous and exploratory spirit of the modern economic life emerging in the 19th century cities was reflected also in the arts of the period. Of course, this transformation depended on the development of institutions that enabled dynamism, including various legal rights, laws governing corporations, and financial institutions. The real crux, though, and one not given enough weight until now, is the rise of modern values, the spread of modern attitudes, precepts, and beliefs. These modern values could be grouped roughly under the headings of individualism, thinking for oneself, working for oneself, willingness to break away from one's group, break away from convention, vitalism, relishing challenges, overcoming obstacles, satisfying curiosity, competing, taking initiative, acting on the world, and self-expression, imagining and creating, demonstrating an insight by testing it, voyaging into the unknown in hopes of making a mark. A basic thesis of the book is that the slow accretion of these modern values finally achieved the critical mass necessary to whet the desire in individuals to innovate, to spur the capabilities required to innovate, and boost the willingness in society to give wide scope for innovation. The book documents the modern values from the onset of the modern era, in Jacques Barzun's terminology, to its winding down, roughly from 1490 to 1940. Individualism began with the humanism of the late Renaissance, vitalism with the quests of the Baroque era and the curiosity of the Enlightenment, and self-expression with the Romantic period. This cultural heritage belonged to the world, certainly to all of the Western nations, but it is implicit in the book that some of these nations did not fully assimilate it into their life, into the values that they act on. Ultimately, some severe reactions to the modern economies set in. The fluctuations and disparities in outcomes, and even in prospects, typical of modern economies, and the endemic unemployment led to socialist opposition. Some nations moved part of the way to a socialist economy, seeing more planning and more state ownership as a step towards stability, equality, and greater employment. Generally speaking, the socialists spoke of greater development of people's capacities to produce, but showed no consideration or awareness of the deeper goals of individuals, the non-material rewards deriving from a life of self-expression, such as exploration and creativity. The socialists neglected then to provide for innovation. The rudderlessness and the social upheaval wrought by the modern economies led, in the interwar years, the 1920s and 1930s, to a corporatist reaction, a reaction invoking some traditional values found in the Middle Ages and even in mercantile, and as long as mercantile capitalism. The corporatist critique in Italy, Germany, and France drew upon a set of traditional values seen there in the left-hand column. The corporatists hated new enterprises invading towns and hated new money, upsetting traditional ways, wealth, and status. So they hated the lack of society's control over the economy. The essence of their thought was the revolt against individualism and self-expression. For them, what mattered was the good of the nation, not the individual, and the government got to decide what is good for the nation. The classic corporatist economies of that time, of interwar years, retained private ownership, but left little control to the owners. They replaced competition and the market with a tripartite system of business confederations, labor unions, both with little power, and the state. Corporatist institutions and policies aimed at social protection and solidarity. These economies were conspicuous for their patronage and lobbying, not to mention cronyism and nepotism. Mussolini, a leading corporatist, promised higher productivity through innovation, but without arranging much for innovation. Corporatists and socialists have continued to claim, right up to the present day, that their systems boost economic performance on their measures. But data from the 1980s and 1990s do not support those claims. In brief, the more socialist economies did not excel at employment, and the more corporatist economies did not excel at growth. Those economies have proved so woefully lacking in innovation, indigenous or even exogenous, that they have been unable to realize their own goals. The book tests its thesis that highly prospering nations require high dynamism, and for that they have to be high in modern values. To simplify the investigation, the book tests whether, to be highly prospering, nations have to be high in modern values. That is done by using the prevalence of several attitudes reported in household surveys, a preference for jobs that are interesting, that involve initiative, that offer change, that present challenges, such as competition, to represent the prevalence of modern values, and using the prevalence of job satisfaction in a nation as a measure of the prevalence of prospering in that nation. Among 18 countries in the OECD, the 6 where job satisfaction was widespread were all above average in modern values. The more prevalent modern values are, the more prevalent job satisfaction is. And by the way, if that feels like it's not quite the question that should have been answered, the same is true for life satisfaction. Also, the countries where traditional values are more prevalent, tend to report very low job satisfaction. Now, let's return to the book's narrative. In the post-war years, Germany and France resumed rapid growth, and Italy found new growth. But it was mostly through technological transfers. There was mounting evidence of lessened dynamism in those countries. In Britain and Germany, later France, the loss of indigenous innovation appears to have been considerable, though concealed by continuing technology transfers from America as long as the supply lasted, and it seems to have lasted until the late 1990s. In America, the growth rate of productivity, after subtracting the part attributable to growth of capital per worker, fell in the early 1970s to about 1/2 of what it had been consistently in the period 1922 to 1972. And it remained there ever since, at about half of its former self, with the exception of the years of the internet build-out, 1996 to 2004, when there was a brief respite. What has happened is that innovation has narrowed, I believe, diminishing in most established industries in particular, and of course rising in some other industries, generally new industries. Predictably, the declines of innovation in these 4 countries were followed by a major ballooning of unemployment in each one of them, which is further evidence that something went wrong. What are the root causes? The book lays much of these declines of dynamism to a rise of traditional and anti-modern or anti-business values in post-war times compared to pre-war times when dynamism was still strong. I will focus on cultural shifts in America, leaving Europe to one side. There has been a spread of the much discussed money culture in America. Hence, fewer people prefer years of austerity trying to innovate with a doubtful pecuniary payoff, only the non-material reward, to working in jobs that pay really well. In many people, the desire to make money has grown into greed. A survey of financial people found that about half of them would engage in inside trading if there was no risk of being caught. This widespread desperation for money must lead to a lot of self-dealing by managers and others in large firms, mutual funds, and banks. Pathologies that must divert managers from innovation to short-termism. In America, at least, there is a much commented rise of an adolescent culture that's low on concentration and self-discipline. Relatedly, there has been a striking devaluation of achievement. Witness the denigration of creative figures. There was just another one last week. Tighter traditional values tie many a young person to their families, circle of friends, or community. Few people are telling the youth these days, "Go west, young man, go west." A new culture of entitlement brings pressure on companies to allow employees to meet family needs by working at home, which is bad for innovation. A key precept of the new corporatism, the right to social protection from the market, has led to pervasive patronage from politicians and campaign contributions from corporations and labor unions. When established corporations are protected through special interest legislation, such as evergreening of old patents, these corporations become less interested in innovation than in rent-seeking. And after they've got their carve-outs and their special interest tax deductions, outsiders with potentially innovative ideas are less able to enter. So they cannot innovate, while the insiders, now protected, can drop whatever defensive innovation they were going to do. They don't need to innovate. So it's a double whammy. The nexus between private and public in education, medical care, and pharmaceuticals is especially harmful to, is especially impeding innovation there. Another precept of the new corporatism, that the state is needed to set important directions for the economy, leads to elites in government playing a larger role in the nation's attempts at innovating, and ordinary people doing grassroots innovation to a smaller role. And it is the ordinary people doing grassroots innovation who, being up close to the problems and the opportunities, have an advantage at innovating. Yet another, that's it, I'll make a cut here. Thus, America has strayed pretty far from the pioneer spirit captured by Willa Cather and the movie Shane. And the new values have choked off much of the modern economy's dynamism, not just caused a loss of efficiency, which was the focus of books by Mansur Olson and before him, Jean-Baptiste Say. Modern values, if they are predominant, spark the engine of human imagination that drives the innovation that is central to the modern economy. In contrast, some traditional or anti-modern values directly inhibit people from making attempts to innovate, and these values, if they prevail over modern values, foster corporatist policies that impede or even block innovation if there are any attempts. What sort of an economy ought we to aim for now? What is the good and the just? Some serious people have suggested we say goodbye to growth. Now, my book agrees that it is especially the non-material rewards that were the great gift to nations with their modern economies, with modern economies. But now prominent economists and commentators are proposing to say goodbye to dynamism and prospering. They're advocating a focus on the quality of life. Amenities like sports stadiums, comforts like clean streets, and security. A well-known report from the OECD views wealth and leisure as the highest goods. My book argues that an economy, to be a good economy, must be structured to offer participants prospects of the good life. It would be an injustice to deprive people of prospects of the good life, prospects for the good life. Further, the book sees the good life as the conception developed across centuries in the modern era by a succession of philosophers and humanists, a life of exploration, creativity, and discovery. This modern conception of the good life derives from Pico della Mirandola at the end of the 1400s, Martin Luther, Montaigne, Cervantes, Shakespeare, Hume, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, William James, and Henri Bergson. Philosophers use the word flourishing to characterize this sort of life. It's apparent, I think, that the prospering I was describing before, that came to the modern economies, is a splendid example of the philosopher's flourishing. Moreover, ordinary people have no other source of flourishing but the business economy. Where else are they going to find the opportunities? So the modern economies were unique and necessary for the provision of the good life to large numbers of participants, all the way to the grassroots. Now, I've just talked about the good life and the good economy. An economy both good and just must be geared to offer those with the poorest prospects of the good life the best prospects possible. If some people are not oriented toward the conception of the good life, this modern conception, a just society will allow them to operate their own parallel economies. All this breaks with accepted thought. Both the left and the right and the corporatists overlook the world of creation with its imagining and venturing and the resulting personal growth in favor of materialist criteria such as leisure and wealth. But the sort of quality life that they appear to envision is no substitute for the good life. The good life is a wild ride through an economy with an open future, an economy offering unimagined rewards, a life of Kierkegaardian mystery, Nietzschean challenge, and Bergsonian becoming. This is what we must hope to regain. To conclude, I would just make one comment about strategy. I would say that it will be necessary to broaden to the whole economy the grassroots innovation that found its footing, especially in California, in garages, in the music business, and in the film industry, and a few sparkling companies. The nation must aim for this more participatory kind of economy for a grassroots revolution. Thank you.
So Silicon Valley is often held as a hotbed of innovation, which it is. But in, let's say, 1999, there was a huge number of copycat companies trying to just sort of get big, fat, boilerplate. How do you distinguish between, and encourage the real innovation versus just sort of pure exploitation?
Well, that's why we have wizened old financiers with green eye shades and tons of experience who use their intuition about what might fly and what probably won't. And we like to leave them in charge of the nation's purse. They will finance what seems good to them and say no to what doesn't. Of course, there's sometimes a diversity of opinion. By the way, Schumpeter thought that the financiers were omniscient. They had some sort of mystical knowledge of it. I don't think that. But This is simply the fact that nobody has foreknowledge of what's going to work and what's not going to work is part of the game. It's, you might say, the downside of the game, that there are an awful lot of people who try and fail, but that's I don't see any alternative to that.
I was always amazed at people like Henry Ford, how he's able to expand so quickly, so fast in the U.S. and worldwide. You know, there was no internet, no fax machines. He's putting up factories, which are a lot of capital investments and a lot of know-how, how to build a large factory of something that's never done. So a lot of unknown that we deal with today, a lot of unknown. And kind of what can we learn? How was he able to move so fast? I mean, I perceive a very difficult time.
I do discuss Henry Ford for a paragraph or so, which doesn't make me a profound Ford scholar, but I think what distinguished Ford was, as some have said before, principally a remarkable vision. And he used to insist that he didn't know a damn thing more about building a car than anybody else did. And he just, in every case, used state-of-the-art methods to assemble his cars. So it wasn't in the car. It was in his vision of what the demand for the car would be if it were if the price were to be if the price were right, and the price could be right if the demand was big enough, and so it's something like that. I don't know about where he got his capital. Probably he started with a relatively small amount of capital, but quickly expanded once he got the confidence of financial people.
Question then, of all the countries in the world right now, which one do you think is the most modern and the most dynamism?
Thanks for the question, Bob. Gives me a chance to talk about China. Through it's a very curious thing, but I got invited to be dean of the new Wadu Business School in the early months of 2010. I'd hardly set foot in a business school, let alone been a dean. But by this time I was interested in innovation, so I saw it as an opportunity. So I started to go to China regularly for about 2 weeks at a time, about 4 times a year. And at first I thought, China, it's all about technological transfers, principally from the United States. There surely is no indigenous innovation here. And then some of my colleagues among the professors reinforced this prejudice by saying, yes, here in China, people are afraid to stand out from the group. They're conformist, they're timid, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought, well, that's that. But then my handlers started to push me out into visits to factories after a while. And I began to see with my own eyes that, my gosh, these people, maybe they're not innovating the socks off of the world, but they certainly are thinking about innovation, and they are very sophisticated. And it must be only a matter of time before before some of the ideas they have make people work, and then make people sit up and take notice. There was a zipper factory that, to this day, impressed me enormously with its creativity and its spirit. They knew everybody in the zipper business around the world, and they weren't just state of the art. They were creative. Now I prodded some of my young colleagues to do some statistical work with me, and this work is still ongoing. It's bedeviled by complications, but my tentative guess from this research so far is that the rate of growth of what economists call total factor productivity, that part of the growth of output per man hour not explained by the growth of capital per man hour, that total factor productivity growth in China is about 2%. The thing is, it's being we are being distracted from that by the continuing growth that comes from other sources in China that accounts for something like a 7% growth rate of product, or maybe a 6 or 5% growth rate of productivity per hour, and even more a few years ago. And what's this other growth coming from? Well, after technological transfers have led to the introduction of up-to-date technologies in the sophisticated companies along the coast of China, there is still the process of what Dick Nelson and I called diffusion of technologies across the rest of the economy, and what's going on in China now is two things. First of all, they're continuing as best they can with new technological transfers, although America is making that harder and harder for them. But at the same time, you're getting also, so to speak, technological transfers from the west coast of China to the interior of China, so that you're getting strong productivity growth through that diffusion of the cutting edge technologies that had made their way to the more pioneering companies. Well, what's the number for the United States? I said that total factor productivity growth had fallen in half, almost from day to night, around 1972, 1973. What are the numbers? Remarkably, the rate of growth of total factor productivity in the United States from 1922 to 1972 was very stable, with fluctuations, but I mean it was not trending anywhere. Stable around 2% per annum. But then since 1972, it's been stable at around 1% per annum. So actually, China looks like its rate of indigenous innovation actually exceeds that of the United States. It's just being overshadowed in China by all the productivity gains coming from diffusion, plus any remaining technological transfers. Yes?
People are thinking innovatively about what is a city and what is a community.
I won't attempt to take that very far, but I do dwell for a page or so on cities in the chapter of my book on the rise of economies of dynamism, what was going on there. And I make the point that one of the things going on there was that cities were growing up. A surprisingly large number of cities were growing up. In England, for example, London was, on some measures, the only city around. And then after things got going in 1815 in Britain, pretty soon there were 5 cities on the same measure. 5 cities in Britain. So you had all this interactivity going on of people talking to one another, companies exchanging views, ideas, information. I think that was very integral to the explosion, from an historical perspective, integral to the explosion of productivity in Britain that began around 1815, almost like a shot. And now, whether you can kind of artificially create that by saying, hey, let's build a city here, and they will come. I'm not sure they will come. I think that would be the big question. Will they come? What exactly is necessary for them to come? I would hate to see the federal government launch a program to create cities in the United States according to some academic formula, most likely by people who know not very much about it. On the other hand, if some region of the country thinks it can survive by creating a new city, well, more power to it. Maybe it'll work.
Do you see the diffusion or the technological transfer to Vietnam also happening at similar rate to China, or is this like?
I don't know the productivity growth numbers, but I don't have to know the numbers to make the educated guess that productivity growth has taken off in Vietnam, and they have opportunities for technological transfer not only from the United States but also from other Asian countries such as South Korea and such as China. Even without having looked at the numbers, there's no doubt in my mind that they've enjoyed a very rapid growth of productivity in the past 10 or 15 years. I was conscious when I was there quite a few years ago that there's quite a heritage of top-down government, a lot of government control, and probably a lot of social protection, a lot of corporatism. And so I don't know to what extent they've graduated out of that. Thank you very much.